Oh, I've been muted this whole time. Lovely. I wasn't saying anything, but even still. Probably need to edit this stream title though. Save. Alrighty. Let's just do a game of Minesweeper, see if anybody shows up, and if not, then I'll just get started. And talk to myself for a little while. Honestly, most of this streaming is for me to occupy my own time and not really to talk to chat, you know. I want to just have a record of me saying these things. It's not the if nobody ends up showing up, I'll just talk to myself for a little while. Just a little bit of a sad existence, but what can you do? What can ye do? What can ye do? Sorry. Anyway, I guess I can just talk about why I'm doing this video. Um, I don't know. I've seen this guy's videos before. Um, I've watched a couple of them. They were like fine. It felt like um they weren't super interesting or anything, but they seemed fine. And this guy claims to have some kind of degree. So, I more or less just took him at his word on some things if I didn't feel like I had enough uh material to comment on. Um but uh I saw this video and it had a different thumbnail um when I first saw it. It was about all truth being subjective, and I was interested to see what he would say about that because I think, one of the few people who would just openly call myself a relativist. Um, and I wanted to see how he addressed the topic, and it was very disappointing to say the least. Um, so I'm just gonna see what happens. Also, this is a little bit fucked, isn't it? Yeah, this is just a little bit. Well, this is probably gonna force a guess at some point, but let's see if we can just fill out the rest of it without needing to force a guess. Like it could be that we have um only four left, right? So it would be because then it would be one, two, three, or rather one, two, three, four. So if we have exactly four left after we fill out the rest of this board, then we should be fine. Um, but who knows? Who knows? Who knows? Yeah, this is just a stream warm-up game, really. I've been yammering. Um, yammering is my preferred version of yapping. I like yammering better. But yes, this is mostly just a pre-stream warm-up game. Um, I was also talking a little bit about my experience with this person. Oh my god, there are... Oh wait, there's still more up here. I was gonna say, like... So, 1, 2, 3... Oh, that's just a 50-50. Lovely. As is this. Well, shit. Okay. Yep. That was not happening. Alright, well... Anyway. Yeah, I was saying that when I saw this thumbnail, it seemed... it was a different thumbnail than it is right now. I think because of A/B stuff. A/B testing or whatever. Um... Dude, WK Games, this stream is not about Geometry Dash. Um, I would I would like you to, if you're going to comment, then you should comment on the actual stream that I'm having. Anyway, WK Games, again, not the topic of the stream. So, anyway, uh, anyway, background. I saw this first section, and I felt like this first section had enough in it that I fervently objected to the things he was saying. So we're just gonna mosey on into this, and if this gets boring, maybe I'll just read something.
Right, you know the drill. You've sent me the worst philosophical takes that you've ever come across.
Also, how's the volume in comparison to me?
So that I can have a go at defending them. So let's get started. My
Is
name is Joe Folly,
this?
and
It's
this
a
is
little.
Unsolicited Advice.
I guess
Okay, here
it's
is a
like
bad philosophy
balanced
take from
mostly.
Sigilligus.
I can try to turn it down just a little bit for myself.
Right, you know the drill. You've sent me the worst philosophical takes that you've ever come across, so that I can have a go at defending them. So let's get started. My
I
name
think
is
this
Joe
is
Folly,
fine.
and this is Unsolicited Advice. Okay, here is a bad philosophy take from Sigilligus, and it reads, all truth is subjective. I've had people tell me this IRL with a straight face. The idea that all truth is subjective, I think, possibly falls into the...
Okay, so this is the bad philosophy take that he's discussing, that all truth is subjective. I mean, I can raise my own volume, I guess. Sure. How's it now? Is it better now? It's about as loud as this mic. It is as good as it's gonna get. Um. Yeah. Anyway.
the camp of deep. This is a term that I'd only come across pretty recently.
Anyway.
The idea that all truth is subjective, I think, possibly falls into the camp of deepities. This is a term that I'd only come across pretty recently, actually. It's essentially a phrase that sounds very deep, but on closer inspection either seems to fall apart or just doesn't seem to have that much in it. In this case,
I mean, why? I feel like you can. Sure. How is he gonna elaborate on this?
I would argue that all truth is subjective is ultimately just a deepity. In practice, it's not a coherent position to hold, because if you think that all truth is subjective, then there's just the standard comeback of, right, well, is that truth subjective? And if it is, then there's no reason why we should expect it to hold universally. And if it's not, then you have one example of something that isn't subjectively true, something that is objectively true, in which...
Yeah. So this objection doesn't work. Um, for reasons that I've explained before, but uh all truth can be if somebody believes that all truth is subjective, then yes, they are going to endorse the idea that also the statement all truths is subjective are subjective is a subjective truth. They're going to endorse that. That doesn't actually undermine their point though, because you are already because you're assuming that to them, when they say something like all truth is subjective, they are actually saying something like, for all truths, all of them are subjective, and like there's a continual chain up, uh, an infinite regress, as they like to say it. But that's they don't need to commit to that. Somebody who thinks all truth is subjective does not need to commit to that. Um, and if they say something like all truths are relative to a subject, it doesn't. They don't need to make a statement that um they don't need to then commit to something beyond that. And in fact, they're not. It is okay for you to say all truths are subjective, and for somebody else to say all truths are objective, right? From the perspective of the subjectivist, these are not um these are not incompatible. You're allowed to have that, because for them, truths inherently can't scope over the whole of all truths. Like a truth can't scope over all perspectives. Thus, you know, saying truth is objective is just as much a perspectival truth as any other. I'm not explaining this super well, but I think WK games say is objective truth, and anything anyone else says is subjective truth. I mean, hey, man. Also, to be clear, it doesn't just because all truth is subjective, it doesn't also mean that any view is as good as any other. Like, it can be relative to a subject and also still be such that it's coherent between subjects, right?
which case the statement just refutes itself. So there
So
is
no, it doesn't refute itself.
a sense in which this is kind of one of the ultimate bad philosophy takes, in that it just straightforwardly entails its own
How often do I do these kinds of streams? I don't know. Whenever I feel like it, just look at my live feed and see.
falsity or its own unseriousness, for want of a better word. I do, however, think that it does contain some kind of insight in it. I think that when most people say all truth is subjective, what they're trying to get at is the idea that everyone is talking from a perspective, and that perspective is going to be informed by their particular personal history. Like,
WK Games, if you don't stop talking about the fucking like leaderboard, I'm just going to time you out.
I think that there are certain interpretations of Nietzsche's perspectivalism that fall roughly along these lines. And
Um, don't know enough about Nietzsche to comment on that one.
in as much as somebody's just trying to express that, I actually think this is a very good point. The other thing that I would say, just regarding subjectivity more generally, and I recently wrote a blog post about this, is that I think that quite a lot of the time, when people talk about something being subjective or objective, they often are trying to get at whether a concept is stable or unstable as it appears between persons. That's
Hold on. He wrote a blog post about this. Let's see. No thanks. Um, the joys of slow reading, oh, the rise of show vulnerability. Is this the one that he's talking about? Like, without God, is everything permitted? This would be May. This one is in July.
sounds a bit abstract, but the debate that got me thinking about this was this idea of can we have objective goodness without God? And it's often taken for granted that with God,
Probably this one. Get out of my face pop-up. Oh, this is really not a long article. Okay, let's read this. See what it's got going for it. Um, can you read it? Yeah, you guys can read it. So, I was recently invited to speak at the Durham Union to oppose the motion without God, all is permissible. It was an absolute pleasure. I don't know what the Durham Union is, and I have posted a full transcript of my speech below if you'd like to read it. Hold on, let me bring this to the main monitor and bring the chat over to here. Okay, sure. See ya, exclaimer. Um It suffers a little from having to fit a lot into 8 minutes of time frame, but I hope it's a relatively fresh angle on the question, or as much as anything can be afresh in this ancient debate. If God does not exist, is everything permitted? This is Ivan Karamsov's question for an atheist worldview. Those among you uh, unfortunate enough to be subjected to a lecture series on propositional logic will recognize this as a conditional claim. Not really saying much yet, but sure. We could easily rephrase it another way. If God does not exist, then there are no moral facts. Hold on. Um, no, that's not necessarily. No, you cannot. Uh, if God does not exist, there are no moral facts. That doesn't show. That does not show that everything could be permissible, and that could be the moral fact. Like a moral, like this is a really actually basic mistake that people make with error theorists as well, because when somebody is denying that there are moral facts, they are not saying everything is permissible. They are denying the modality entirely. You don't need to um you don't need to say that if um because they would also say no to the claim everything is permissible. An error theorist would, because they don't believe in permissibility. They also don't believe in impermissibility. They don't believe in obligation, duty, whatever. So these are not the same thing, right? So if God does not exist, is everything permitted is not equivalent to if God does not exist, then there are no moral facts. Not the same thing at all. The truth conditions of such a conditional are simple. If there is a single counterexample of a philosophical system where there are moral facts and yet God does not ground them, then the conditional is refuted and we must dismiss the motion. Um, no, not necessarily. Not necessarily, right? Because this would be a really easy thing to it would be really easy to refute the argument then, because there are a lot of moral systems that have moral facts and also no God to ground them. There are so many systems that fit that description. The question is whether or not such systems are true or not, right? Like it doesn't matter if this system exists if it isn't true. It could just be wrong. The conditional nature of this claim also makes it unrelated to your actual belief in God. You could, like Hugo Grotius, be a theist who thinks morality would still be there without God. You could also, like Richard Dawkins, be an atheist who also rejects objective moral facts. Does Dawkins reject objective moral facts? I don't know. I also don't know if Hugo Grotius does either. But if it's like but if you've set it up such that is there a system that has these features, it has moral facts and yet has no God, then the fact that Hugo Grotius exists actually does already refute this, because he believes that there would be morality without God, right? So already by the way you've set it up, you've actually refuted the point. Like, to be clear, I agree with the idea that this is like that the moral argument from God is really silly, but it's not, you haven't really put forward a great version of it. As has now become almost cliche to say, we in the UK live in the wake of a fundamentally Christian worldview. No doubt many will see this as a vote in favor of the proposition, and I do as well. What? Why would. Yeah, so he's arguing against the proposition without God, all is permissible, right? Yeah, so why. I don't see why. Like, this is like just basically an argument from. This is like a bad version of like the argument from convergence. But wait, it's not even that. How would the UK being in the wake of a fundamentally Christian worldview mean that this counts in favor of the proposition? Why would are you just like giving them this point for no reason, just like for rhetorical effect? Because I don't see the connection here at all. However, it can also blind us to the genuine possibilities of deriving ethical systems from non-theistic premises. We only need, um, I mean, sure. I actually think that most people, I'm not going to make that comment because I don't know if that's true. Mm. We only need one countermodel to disprove the motion, so for the avoidance of doubt, I propose three. Though to bear in mind, these are highly simplified versions of each system. Whole books have been devoted to explaining just one of them. So, just to be clear, again, like I would say that like whether or not these systems exist is not what's at issue here. Because these systems could exist and they could be false. In fact, the theist who thinks that this is the case will just say that these systems get it wrong. Like they'll say that in fact they have to invoke God in some way or that they fail to establish objective morals whereas only God can do that. Like they can say that. I'm not saying they would be correct about it, but it's not enough to just point at a counter model and say, "See." Like it has to be like an actually existing counter example for it to refute the motion. The first is moral Platonism. Okay, I'm going to assume that this is like non-naturalist realism, where what is good is defined by the form of the good. Or maybe not. Maybe this is like actual Platonism. This form is not an agent, but an abstract object or paradigm, analogous to how the number 7 grounds all individual uses of the term 7. Okay, yeah. So this is just moral non-naturalism, like in the form in like the style of like a Cuneo or someone like that, right? Like Terence Cuneo, who I think is actually a theist, but I'm not sure. But Joe, I hear you ask, there are also gods in Plato's metaphysics. Or not. Maybe he is actually talking about like real, like what Plato also thought. Um, this is undoubtedly true, but Plato does not think that gods of or any one god grounds the good. The gods do not define what is good, but rather they are good inasmuch as they reflect this metaphysical form of the good. This is how Plato has objective, absolute moral truths without appealing to a god. Additionally, if we are going to play the genealogical game, it's worth noting that this Platonic idea also underpins Christian theology, but God's goodness having filtered into the church, or rather, Christian theology about God's goodness having filtered into the church via Plotinus and Saint Augustine. I mean, in some versions of theology, yes. Uh, though at the same time, not ones that try to get around the Euthyphro dilemma, right? But whatever. The second is the modern Kantian philosopher Christian Korsgaard. Okay, I do know a little bit about Christian Korsgaard, but why not just use Kant? You don't need to use Christian Korsgaard. You can just use Kant. Kant is already has a secular morality that doesn't require God. So why use Christian Korsgaard? Her full argument is pretty complex, but I can give a simplified gloss here. Essentially, she argues that we are already committed to believing in binding moral truths by virtue of valuing human agency. When we take a reasoned action, we implicitly endorse the reasoning behind the action and thus introduce valuation into the equation. Okay. I know like a tiny bit about Korsgaard. I've never found their argument persuasive. Um this just strikes me as extremely unpersuasive. Like the thing is that I even if I accept the idea that when we take a reasoned action, we implicitly endorse the reasoning behind that action, it doesn't necessarily mean we endorse it universally. I can endorse it provisionally, and I can endorse different kinds of reasoning in different different registers, and I often do, right? What's appropriate reasoning for one case is not appropriate reasoning for another. Um, you know, like if I, if I come home and I see my brother's coat on the coat rack, I might reason that my brother is home. But, if somebody told me, well, would you bet your life savings on the idea that my brother is home? Of course I wouldn't, because I don't know that for sure. Maybe he forgot his coat, right? Easily could be the case. So when I take a reasoned action, I am not implicitly endorsing the reasoning behind that action in all cases for all time. Again, though, I don't. This is not necessarily his argument, right? But he's saying, but that's the kind of thing like a Christian apologist would say if they're trying to say, well, isn't a good counterexample, right? Anyway, whether we know it or not, we are then playing the moral game with valuing agency at its core. I just don't agree with that. In order to be consistent, we must then value the reasoned agency of others. I see no reason why. She thus endorses a form of deontology where we are bound to value other people and their agency by the same token that we value our own. Again, just doesn't follow. It has a whiff of the transcendental arguments about it. Not not really. I don't I don't even really see the resemblance to Kant here. Like I would actually say Kant's formulation is much better than this. Um, but sure. Korsgaard's overall moral philosophy is elegant and complicated, but starts from one thing as being valued, agency, and infers everything else from there. The third is Theravada Buddhism. Okay, I don't know anything about Buddhism, so I can't really say much about this. I'm just going to skip this, right? Now, you do not need to agree with any of these moral systems for the purpose of my argument. You can reject the form of the good, or Korsgaard's ethics, or Theravada Buddhism, or all three. My point is that they are coherent philosophical systems that have a moral code, yet do not ground this moral code in God. Yes, but are like the fact that they are coherent does not mean that they are true. And that's the more important part. Like maybe the thing is that good in the case of these philosophies doesn't have the same reference as good in the philosophy of like of a theist who thinks that God grounds the good. Like they would just say that these if they don't agree they if they don't agree with the reasoning made to get to these arguments, then they are under no obligation to say that their argument has been refuted. Any one of them would be sufficient to refute the notion that without God everything is permitted. I use three to illustrate the breadth of the counterexamples on offer. Now, at this point, I can almost feel an objection dancing around the room. Each of these cases postulates that something just is good as a first principle. Um, well, no. Like, Korsgaard's doesn't, right? It doesn't. It doesn't. It in fact doesn't. It explicitly doesn't, and neither would Kant. But whatever. If you were to ask Plato why the form of the good was good, he would probably stare at you blankly, and not just because he would be confused by the black tie. Ha ha ha. If the Buddha was asked why it is desirable to achieve enlightenment and free yourself from samsara, he would have to concede that those things are good. They just are desirable. What? Wait, hold on. Back up, back up, back up. It doesn't matter if they are desirable. I know very little about Buddhism, as I said, but the whole point, if I understand Buddhism, is to free yourself from desire, including the desire to have no desires. So the Buddha would not say it is desirable to free yourself from samsara. That would be against the point. It isn't the point is to rid yourself of desire, and you should not desire to rid yourself of desire. You just should do it. Anyway, and it is true. We have to do this. We cannot get an ought from an is. Notably, he doesn't address Korsgaard's argument, though, because Korsgaard's argument doesn't require a presupposition. At some point, you have to postulate a first principle that just is good. But I hasten to add, this is what the theist must do as well. Well, okay, sure, whatever. I'll get to that argument there, but no, we don't have to do this. And Korsgaard specifically doesn't. Christian Korsgaard is, I believe, a Kantian constructivist, and specifically doesn't postulate anything from the outset about what is good and what is not. Anyway, let's see. If I ask, why is God good? That is, so is he just gonna do the Euthyphro dilemma? The theist must do one of two things. They must either appeal to some descriptive fact that makes him good, he is all loving, all generous, all kind, or they have to stipulate that God just is good, either by, or maybe not, either by will, or, as Aquinas would have it in his response to the Euthyphro dilemma, by essential nature. The trouble with this first path is that it kicks the can down the road. Then it is not God that defines goodness, but one of these properties, which the atheist equally has access to. The issue with the second path is not that it is some sort of gotcha, but we find that grounding goodness in God eventually comes up against the same problem as grounding goodness in anything else. In the final move, we must sit back and declare that something just is good. What? Then it is God that defines good. Wait. So it's in this case, though, it wouldn't be us defining it. It would just be God defining it. But sure. The open question argument is something any moral system has to confront. Well, no. Well, confront, I guess, sure. You could confront it by embracing it. Far from having a philosophical advantage, the theist and atheist are in very similar boats, and can only weigh their moral anchors with this initial irreducible stipulation. I mean, whatever. No, but whatever. If I have done my job right, this brief speech has demonstrated two key things. The first is that not only are there moral systems that do not ground morality in God, but that these are some of the oldest ethical systems in history. I could go on. We could talk about, yeah, I'm not going to talk about this, blah, 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 blah. The fact that we do not take notice of these systems is not because they do not exist, but because we have a cultural blind spot. Do we? I don't know. In the history of philosophy, non-theistic moralities are almost everywhere. The second is that any moral system, whether it features God or not, must stipulate as a first principle that something just is good. No, this is just wrong. This is just wrong. Not every moral system has to stipulate this. And in fact, many do not. Many are like very clear on having to not do this or not wanting to do this. You know? Again, you have an example in your own speech of somebody who does not do this by your own description. She's again, Korsgaard, she argues that we are already committed to believing in binding moral truths by virtue of valuing human agency. When we take a reasoned action, we implicitly endorse the reasoning behind the action and thus introduce valuation into the equation. This is not presuppositional. Sh- She is not saying reasoning or human agency just is good. She is saying she's making like a um almost like a praxeological argument for it. Like she's saying that we already value it in practice, right? So it's just not true at all, even according to you. Um, I keep having to like switch it to live chat. Like even according to you, man, not every moral system requires a presupposition of something just being good. You have an example in your speech of someone who doesn't do that. Whatever. Um. Anyway, also the like symmetry arguments like this in general are just kind of weak. Um. Like this rather. Like, so what if uh religion and theism are on the same ground with respect to this question? Like, we could just say that both of them are insufficient, or we could call it a wash and say that other factors should weigh into the consideration. Whatever. It's just a ridiculous and dumb argument. Why do I have 7 concurrent viewers and no chatters? Is something wrong? Am I getting botted? I kind of wonder. Did WK Games bot me? I should not have 7 viewers and 7 concurrent viewers and 0 chatters. That just seems straightforwardly wrong. But whatever. You can argue that God exists and he does ground morality in this world. Double period, sure. Well, at least um hello. There we go. There we go. There are people. There are people here that actually exist. Anyway. Well, at least this was probably not written by AI if he's making double period mistakes. So that's nice. You can even say that God is the best way to ground morality, but what you cannot say is that God is the only way to ground morality. Again, you have not demonstrated that it. You have not demonstrated the contrary. Again, just showing that there are systems that can do it and according to their own internal logic does not mean that we have to evaluate those systems as successful. And that is the very thing. So I think this wasn't the right blog post then. Um oh, it was probably the one at the top. How long is this? Oh, this is a really short. Okay. So the blog post he was actually supposed to be responding to. That other blog post was really bad, but this was actually the one that I was supposed to be reading. So, if you prowl the bowels of internet comment sections, particularly those around art, music, philosophy, and more, you will find many people arguing about whether things are subjective or objective. That is, roughly speaking, whether they depend on the mind or not. Actually, hold on. I'm gonna finish this part because he does actually touch on the same point, and I will be more equipped to answer it here when he starts to talk about it. Because it's, from what I remember about this part of the video, it's really bad. It's like really dumb and bad. Um, anyway, who wants to see Minesweeper again? Back to Minesweeper. Yeah, there we go.
You can have objective goodness. I've critiqued that position in the past anyway, but there is a more trivial critique that you can level at something like divine command theory, which is the idea that what is moral is determined by God's will, which is to say that that doesn't establish objective moral truths. It establishes subjective moral truths. They're just subjective to the will of God.
Yep. I mean, just true. That's just a correct objection to divine command theory.
And I think one of the reasons why this response basically seems trivial is because if something is true in God's will, and God is the creator and governor of the universe, then in effect you have a stable notion of truth. It doesn't vary between individuals because while it's relative to God's will is sort of intuitively the most important will, and at the very least, it's not like we
Mm,
have different morals between different people. You get
No, that's not at all the case. That's just not at all the case. So like God has his morality and I have my morality. What makes God's will the more important one here? Is it just that he's more powerful than me? Is it that he can punish me when I can't adhere? And if we then say that God doesn't exist, would that mean that whoever has the most power in the world to subject as many people to their will as they can, does that mean that their will is actually the most important one? I would hope you would say no. I would hope you would say no. So in that case, this objection doesn't work. Like this objection to the objection. Like I don't need to concede that God's will is more important or the most important one. And it doesn't need to be stable. God can have his notion and I can have my notion. In fact, that's if we do in fact live in a universe with God and there is and divine command theory is true, that's actually the state of the current universe if it is actually how it works. Because everybody like there are so many different moral perspectives around the world. So there is no like that's literally how it's working currently. And what differentiates God would just be his ability to punish me for not adhering.
a kind of quasi objectivity of morality, even if you don't get that true objective morality, as you would in something like, I don't know, Platonic theories of moral realism, where what is moral is determined apart from any mind, including apart from the mind of God. And this got me thinking that I think the
So no, it's not even quasi realism. It is just moral relativism. Like to be clear, that is just another kind of relativism. It's one where it's stable in terms of like who gets punished for and who gets to enact their moral will, but it's not stable in what people believe about the moral will.
same thing holds for lots of other debates that are, in popular discourse at least, framed around subjectivity and objectivity. We tend to equate subjectivity with loads and loads of variance between individual people and objectivity with invariance between people. And that does hold for objectivity. If something is objective, that is, it's not dependent on the existence of any mind or any collection of minds, then yes, it won't vary between people because it doesn't really have any relation to those people.
Um, I'm gonna I'm gonna leave that one alone. But like, just to be clear, I don't know how if it has no relation to people, then it can't have a truth relation either. So if it's objective, a- and by objective we mean has no relationship to the mind at all, then I don't know how we could say that it actually does have um if it actually does hold the same between people. It just has no relation. It's like it would just be like the noumenal world. We can't say anything about it.
At least not a kind of metaphysical grounding relation. It exists independently. But the converse doesn't necessarily hold of subjectivity. Something can be minds dependent and yet still not vary all that much between individuals. I think that a really good example of this is something like pain. So there are lots of discussions online and in popular discourse and in philosophy journals about whether we have objective concepts of beauty or aesthetics or something like that. And I think that's partly because beauty and interpretations of beauty do tend to vary
Wait, how did we get from pain to beauty?
a little bit between people. This doesn't happen with something like pain. And I suspect that
Oh,
this is
there we go.
because, for all intents and purposes, our experience of pain is practically convergent. And by this, I mean that
So what about I actually think there are counterexamples to this. People who are on morphine will claim to be in pain, but also claim that it's not unpleasant. And I know that this is like an example that a bunch of that like eliminative materialists and illusionists tend to trot out um to try and like debunk qualia. I'm not sure you can use it for that purpose, but it does kind of show that there are circumstances where it is not invariant, you know? And as you said in that earlier blog post, all you need is one counterexample.
Except for a few exceptional cases, we broadly seem to perceive and act pain in roughly similar ways. One exception to this might be something like a monk self-immolating, right? When a monk pours gasoline over themselves and lights himself on fire and then seemingly just sits there until they die. That is one of the few times where
Why does the camera do that in this video? The camera is just moving. Why is it moving?
we can ask questions like, oh, is that monk
Like, it's just zooming in and out for no reason.
really in pain? I think that kind of alerts us to the fact that pain definitely is subjective, because if there were no minds, there would also be no pain. Well, it could be variant between people, but practically it's invariant. If it is variant, it very rarely comes up, and variation in things like perceived beauty come up significantly more often. So I suppose one way that you could really steelman the idea that all truth is subjective would be to say something like this. Truth is a linguistically defined concept, and in as much as it is linguistically defined, you could not have truth without the existence of people or consciousness. You would have reality, sure, but there would be no true statements because there wouldn't be any statements at all.
And this is like a semi like Rortian perspective.
There would be no true propositions because there wouldn't be propositions, at least not how we traditionally conceive of them. If that's true, then true. If that's true, then you do end up with a situation where truth is subjective. However, in this model of the universe, you could also say that because reality definitely exists as its own thing, if you do have minds, they're going to converge on the same concept of truth because we need to figure out what reality actually looks like in order to interact with it and succeed in our goals.
No. So no, that just doesn't follow. In fact, you do not have to have a convergent view of reality in order to get your goals. In fact, the one could argue that having divergent views of reality actually promotes I don't know, like intellectual diversity, which then leads to different discoveries down the road or whatever, right? Um, I would say even in the same person, in different contexts and different registers, they have different views about like what reality is. Again, going back to my earlier example, you know, reasoning that you take to be appropriate in one case is not necessarily reasoning that you will take to be appropriate in another case. You know, so it doesn't follow that truth being a linguistically defined concept means that there will be convergence uh, on what the truth is. There might well be, but it doesn't mean that there will be.
This would be a kind of very loose modern pragmatist story, I suppose. I've talked about this before, but the pragmatist philosopher Hasok Chang made like a brief observation in his most recent book, which was Realism for Realistic People. At least I think it's his most recent book. Maybe he's written one when I wasn't paying attention. He's a brilliant philosopher, by the way. Everyone should go check him out. And he, almost in passing, makes this brilliant yet, on reflection, really obvious point that just because something is subjective or mind dependent doesn't mean that it's mind controlled. Again, pain is a fantastic example of this. Apart
I mean, that's not really sure. That I mean, that's true, but it's not exactly like a. What am I trying to say here? This is not a brilliant observation. Like, in fact, you could. This is actually like a really banal and widely accepted observation in philosophy. Like anybody who believes, it, like fucking Kant, right? He believes that we have faculties of intuition, um or that the form of our intuition is space and time, right? And so it is mind dependent. Like space and time are dependent on minds. And also space and time are not mind controlled because we don't really control our perception of space and time. Like we can't decide to not perceive things as being in space or of space and of time. So like this is not a like it's correct, but I don't really think it's a brilliant observation. It seems like a really basic one, but sure.
from a very few cases, people don't tend to be able to think their way out of excruciating pain. But the pain is definitely dependent on the existence of their mind. And many other types of phenomena, in the almost Kantian sense, might be like this. One of the underrated questions, I think, in the philosophy of beauty, which, philosophers and anthropologists and social scientists do explore, but it doesn't filter down in popular discourse enough, in my opinion, is the question of are there convergent ideals of beauty between people within a society and between societies. This doesn't mean that all
This is what do you mean this isn't talked about in popular culture? This is like commonly invoked as a reason for grounding objective beauty, saying that that cultures that there are cross-cultural similarities about what humans find beautiful, like symmetry, for example, right? Symmetry is something that lots of people will say is like cross-culturally valued as beautiful. Like it especially comes up in the discussion of like beauty with respect to attractiveness, and does in fact have uh a lot of pop cultural misunderstandings about it.
societies will end up with the same idea of beauty, as that's definitely not true. But it could be that there are some consistent through lines. Some psychologists have proposed that one of those through lines might be beautiful natural landscapes. You know, they propose some kind of evolutionary theory whereby we are relaxed by the presence of broad, lush-looking natural land masses or something like that. And if that's true,
Yeah, so that's like the worst kind of evolutionary psychology. Like just completely unfalsifiable just so story.
then that does tell you something that, in my opinion, is pretty philosophically significant, because it would mean that even if beauty were subjective in the sense that it depends on everyone's minds, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is free to have their own idea of beauty. It could be that there is
What?
empirical convergence there. So
No. Hold on. No. It would show that it would literally just show that there is empirical convergence, right? It wouldn't show that people aren't free to disrupt or reject that empirical convergence for themselves. You know, if you can induce a taste in yourself other than the one that is uh averaged across all of humanity, that would not make you wrong. And I wouldn't find this to be philosophically significant at all. Like already we arguably have things that are like averaged across humanity, almost universally considered to be good, but or universally considered to be beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. This does not mean that people aren't free to vary with respect to this question.
that would be my most defensible version of the idea that all truth is subjective. But at the same time, that really does take the wind out of the sails of the proposition, right? We have effectively turned what initially seemed like it was going to say that, yeah, all of our ideas about truth are just fundamentally wrong and truth can vary between people, has just ended up being that the existence of statements depends on the existence of minds. And that there's not as much meat on the bones of that philosophical thesis.
What do you mean? Hold on.
Depends on the existence of minds. And that in people has just ended up being that the existence of statements depends on the existence of minds. And that there's not as much meat on the bones of that philosophical thesis. Don't get me wrong.
There is plenty of meat on that on the bones of that philosophical thesis. Like there is so much. Like arguably, like all of it, all of deflationary truth is based on the meat of that philosophical thesis. Like from Tarski to like Rorty to anybody, right? Anybody who holds a pragmatist view about truth, like anybody who holds like any linguistic view of truth. So that would be pragmatists and deflationists, right? Anybody who holds that would consider that philosophically significant and would have a lot to say about that. Like I think that the deflationary claim that a statement is true if and only if like the T sentences hold, um that's like a pretty radical claim about truth, that it's fundamentally linguistic in nature. Because like oh my god, a correspondence theorist would say that the truth is out there, right? Like they would say, or that they would say that like even if truth is a linguistic concept, it can fail or succeed at corresponding to the way the world really is. And if you have an entirely linguistic view of truth, then you don't necessarily have to hold that proposition. So there is a lot of philosophical meat on that bone.
I still think that it is actually quite significant. And if you accepted it, it would have implications for how you approached the world and certainly how you approach certain philosophical problems. But
Yes to the latter, no to the former, arguably.
nonetheless, it wouldn't be as earth-shakingly shattering as the idea that everyone can have their own individual truth. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider
To be
subscribing.
clear, again, I'm going to repeat this. Just because saying all truth is subjective does not mean every person has their own individual truth. As you yourself said, like you need to understand that like when people are philosophically defending that thesis, they're not necessarily like using the dumb version that you attribute to them.
Either to the channel, or if you want to get access to exclusive content, to the Patreon. The
No
links are in the
thanks.
description. Sorry about this, I'm going to have to do the next few in my glasses because my contact lenses were causing me far too much grief. So for the next few, you've got Nerd Joe. Anyway, our next philosophical bad take is from PT5 Shorts, and it reads, everyone is religious in some way, brackets, an atheist of atheists. Now, this has become a very popular talking point, and I think it probably always
This is just the Jordan Peterson line, right?
has been amongst religious apologists. The thing is, I think it fundamentally trades on an equivocation of definitions, because in some sense, they're right? If you broaden the definition of religious to basically include anything you care about, or think is right, or motivates you to action, or you find personally meaningful, then yeah, I guess there's a sense in which every
Okay, I'm probably going to agree with him on this one.
atheist holds some kind of religious view, but we've also stretched the definition of religion so far that it kind of doesn't resemble our common sense usage. So I mentioned this in my video on Jordan Peterson's Jubilee appearance, where he sort of tried to do a similar thing with the concept of worship. His claim was that all atheists worship something, and then when he was asked, what do you mean by worship, which is a fair enough question in this context, he said, well, you worship whatever is at the top of your value hierarchy. In which case, yes, everyone worships something, but also we've so watered down the definition of worship that it doesn't resemble how you'd use the term worship in a religious context. The reason I think this kind of argument is still valuable to look at, even though I think it's wrong, is that a really good way to tell whether you're equivocating on a definition is to play out its inferential consequences. The inferential consequence of all atheists are religious, if we use religious in its everyday sense, that is, belonging to a major religion or worshipping some kind of deity, the implication of all of that is that every single atheist secretly worships some kind of personal, transcendent being. I just don't think that's plausible, right? You can test that statement via its implications and seeing whether those implications are true, and it just turns out that all atheists are religious under that interpretation is straightforwardly false. If you broaden the interpretation of religious to mean worshipping something or deeming something as important or having some kind of felt existential meaning in life, then yes, pretty much every atheist will end up as religious, but that no longer tells you anything significant about atheism. The idea behind all atheists are religious, as far as I can tell, is to sort of catch the atheist in a bind, right? You're going to say something like, you say you're an atheist, you say you don't believe in any religions, and yet deep down you too are religious. But if you're using religious in exactly the same way, then that's going to then translate as you say that you don't believe in any kind of meaning and you never feel anything and you don't worship or prioritize anything, but you do those things, to which the atheist can then respond by saying, look, I never claimed that there was no such thing as meaning or felt meaning or that there was no such thing as worshipping something. I never claimed that I didn't have any kind of value system for my life. I wouldn't even be able to act if I didn't have some kind of value.
Okay, well, so the issue though is that the stronger version of this argument would say that the atheist is committed to some kind of leap of faith, just like the religious person is, and that the religious person's leap of faith is on no better is on no rather no worse grounds than the atheists, right? That's the stronger version of that argument, right? But I don't know. Yeah, and I mostly agree with this. This is not super interesting. Um, I did want to look at this, right? So true, Shaden Core. So true. Shaden Core? Shaden Core? I don't know. I'm gonna read this actually because I do want to because I thought his comments on the beauty thing were really weird, right? You don't really care about what's subjective. Some thoughts on what people really want when they're talking about subjectivity and objectivity. If you prowl the bowels of internet comment sections, particularly those around art, music, philosophy, and more, you will find many people arguing about whether things are subjective or objective. That is, roughly speaking, whether they depend on a mind or not. They will discuss whether there are any objective standards for art, whether there is objective morality without God, or whether music is getting worse objectively. I am a relatively simple person. I enjoy philosophy and hold on. It's not an M dash, not an M dash. That's just a normal dash. I enjoy philosophy and like it when people get excited about philosophical questions. However, if I could make one small suggestion, I think our terminology is getting in the way of our discussions here. I think a lot of what people are trying to get at here when they talk about subjectivity and objectivity is the extent to which a particular experience does or can vary between individuals. Maybe, maybe. I'm going to see what example he gives. Take a classic philosophical problem I see posed online. Can there be objective goodness without God? Oh, sorry. Oopsies. Minesweeper is now out of the way. On the face of it, this is a question about objectivity, but upon closer inspection, that framing makes very little sense. After all, objective normally means mind independent, and in a divine command theory system of morality, morals are necessarily dependent on the mind of God. However, when you dig into why people care about this question, you see that they are less concerned about objectivity, but with a lack of variance with what can be viewed as morally correct. This is reflected in the way Dostoevsky poses the question. Without God, everything is permitted. Though the context of that phrase is its own interesting topic. The worry is that without the existence of God, our morality could shoot off in a million different directions or cease to exist altogether, with every course of action being just as valuable as any other. Um, sure, but then they would also be as disvaluable as any other, right? Because you're denying the modality, as I've already explained. But on the other hand, take something that is inarguably subjective, the experience of pain. There is no question that we are all conscious minds there is no question that were all conscious minds to suddenly cease to exist, there would be no such thing as pain anymore. It is thus subjective. So why don't we have the same sorts of debates about pain as we have about our emotional or subjective experiences? We do. We do, in fact, have debates about this, about what's objectively painful and what's not. Why don't we say that pain is simply a matter of perspective? Or you have your definition of pain and I have mine. Some people do. Some people do this. Not everybody has the same exact definition of pain. Sometimes people categorize pain into different types of pain, right? Some people will say mental pain and physical pain, right? Even though neurologically they're like more or less the same thing as far as I'm aware. Again, we see that the reason is probably because there's so little perceived variation in how people act when they are in pain. But that's not the same thing as what pain is to them. And thus we infer there is little variation in how people experience pain. For all intents and purposes, although pain is subjective, it has some of the most important properties of objectivity. It remains practically stable over time and between people. I am not denying that we do not care what is objective and what is subjective. Um, yeah, say, for example, in subsets of the debate between realists in philosophy of science and anti realists. Well, if we ask Latour, we would say that people actually don't care, and in fact, don't make the distinction. But go watch my Latour streams, or just read Latour yourself. Debates about the bona fide subjectivity and objectivity about bona fide, not the bona fide, but just bona fide, subjectivity, and objectivity abound within different fields of philosophy. I just think that in popular discourse, we often say objective and subjective when what we often mean is stable and unstable. But why does this matter? Well, I suspect that while we spend a lot of time talking about objectivity or subjectivity or different experiences or properties, we are all potentially skimming over some very important questions. Take the debate around what is beautiful. In popular discourse, so much of the discussion about beauty is taken up with subjectivist platitudes like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or requisite objectivist reaction, which points to some historically great work of art and challenges anyone to not find it beautiful, or declares that they do not care about what other people think. Their definition of beauty is objectively correct. This immediately kills any interesting discussion in the water. But if we changed our framing to recognize that we often care about sorry. But if we changed our framing to recognize that what we often care about is not subjectivity or objectivity, but variation and change, then a whole series of questions become salient and interesting that would otherwise go unasked. Yes, but it's a different question. As somebody who's in the trenches about subjectivity in art, this is just a different question. Like this is a sociological question. It's an anthropological question. It's not really what I'm discussing when I discuss art. For example, to what extent do people within a community converge on what they deem beautiful and ugly? Do we measure this using a simple emotional reaction? Well, it seems like things get complicated because today we have a bunch of words that signal aesthetic appreciation while explicitly denying that something is beautiful. See the term ugly hot or people's professed love and attraction to the medium ugly. Don't know I don't know what this is about, but sure. If we do get significant convergence within a given set of people, we can plausibly define a definition of the word beauty within the linguistic community. No, no, we can't. Because that assumes, for example, that what the community with that within the nah. First of all, you can always subdivide a linguistic community, but I see no reason to think, for example, that any given linguistic community has a better claim to it than any other. Or if any given person within the linguistic community uh, has a better claim to it than any other. And it's not really what I'm talking about when I call something beautiful, right? When I say something is beautiful, I'm not saying in this linguistic community it is beautiful or it meets the necessary and sufficient conditions for beauty given the average standards of the linguistic community that I occupy. That's not what I'm doing. In fact, I may be trying to change the linguistic standards. I might be trying to change the definition of beauty. And trying to define it this way as just whatever the linguistic community decides, it precludes the ability for me to try and change it. It precludes the ability for anyone to try and change it. Because then you get into somebody who thinks something else that's not beautiful according to the linguistic community actually is beautiful. And they say, well, you're wrong according to the linguistic community. Well, who cares? Who cares? I can use that word how I want. We can see how far you have to drift to the outskirts of that community before the usage begins to shift. Not really. Then you can extend the question among groups of communities. Are there things that whole nations consistently consider beautiful? Is there more convergence on definitions of beauty about art or architecture than there are about people? Is it that someone needs to hold certain characteristics to be considered above a minimum level of beauty, but then there is wide divergence over what people consider the most beautiful? No. This is the issue. This is just this is just like not answering the question. When I'm arguing about whether someone or something is beautiful, I'm not necessarily trying to appeal to the linguistic community or trying to show them that they fit the standard that the linguistic community has set. It's just a different question. Again, it's a sociological question. It is not a question of like what is really beautiful. Again, this is like the mistake that this is true. This would be like saying, you know, we define morality as whatever the linguistic community deems to be acceptable, and immorality is what the linguistic community deems to be unacceptable. Like, does this like by definition, anything that's like deviant is going to be classified as immoral? Whatever. Finally, as a particularly ambitious anthropological are there things that all humans universally or near universally hold on, these are not the same thing. These are not the same thing. Universally and near universally are so different. They are worlds apart. Anyway, are there things that people universally consider beautiful? Some psychologists have proposed a good candidate for this. Some psychologists have proposed a good candidate for this are wide natural landscapes, carting broad evolutionary reasons. However, testing this among cross sections of different cultures would be a significant undertaking. This would not hold universally. And as I already said in response to the video itself, this is like evolutionary reasons for why we enjoy uh and relaxing in landscapes. Like these are practically untestable. They're not real theories. Exactly, Lord Canty. Um, it's either universal or it's not. There is no near universally. It just is universally true or universally held or it's not. Even one exception disproves the generality or disproves the absolute generality rather. And again, this is just an anthropological question. It's not what people are actually debating when they talk about subjective and objective truth. They aren't debating whether or not people converge. They're debating the metaphysics of it. It could be that none of this comes to pass. I myself am skeptical. But my point is that there are questions we can make genuine and significant progress on. They are interesting questions to pose and ones from which we can draw practical conclusions. I actually don't think that this is a very interesting question, at least with respect to, like, was there an evolutionary reason for why we find landscapes relaxing? Because again, it's not practically testable. There's no like test that you could show for this. Like to be clear, not all evolutionary psychology is bunk. A lot of it is, but not all of it. And some evolutionary psychology is testable. Like you would need to formulate a hypothesis that would rise or fall based on the perceived evolutionary pressure that you've given. And I cannot imagine one uh that would be there for beautiful landscapes. Right. I have buried the lead here a little bit. The reason for this post was that I have become enraptured with a seemingly simple and intuitive observation by the philosopher Hasok Chang, which seems so obvious on reflection, yet is so often overlooked in our popular discourse. So this is the thing that he said earlier, that it can be mind dependent and not mind controlled, right? Yeah. Call something subjective is not the same thing as saying that anything goes, and to be fair, most philosophers recognize this. Yes, they do. But the connection has become so strong in our popular discussions that I thought it was worth pointing out. This is very boring. Anyway, continuing.
Value system. It really does diffuse the critique in that sense. So there is a trivial sense in which all atheists, or almost all atheists, are religious. But I think when you play out the inferential consequences of that more plausible version, you tend to find that it just doesn't have any kind of relevance anymore. It kind of becomes true, but it also at the same time doesn't have any kind of bearing on discussions of atheism or religion, and it certainly doesn't catch the atheist in a bind. So yeah, in some sense, this take is either bad or trivial. That's never a good place to be when you're writing a philosophical argument. And I know because I've been there many, many times. But moving on. So, this example of bad philosophy comes from Jacob English NV8XQ, and it reads, "Since writing on toilet walls is neither for critical acclaim nor financial reward, it is the purest form of art." Now,
Um, I would just okay. I have no thoughts on this. I have no thoughts on this. This seems like a profoundly uninteresting question, so I'm just gonna skip it.
so our next bad philosophy take comes from Fitz Chevalery 6597, and it reads, "Death sentences should be carried out by a sword duel so that we ensure a natural possibility of failure. And no, I don't just want justification for why I study."
What? Death sentences should be carried out by a sword duel so that we ensure a natural possibility of failure. Is this a philosophy take? What? I'm gonna see what he says about this just because this doesn't make any sense to me. Like, what is the possibility of failure here?
study the blade. Man, studying the blade's kind of cool. I wish I knew how to sword fight. You can't really get swords in the UK. You're not allowed. Which I know is probably for the greater good. But it is a shame. It's kind of made me want to take up some kind of Renaissance sword.
Yeah, like what do you what can exactly? What kind of fucking question is that? Or what kind of like fucking this is just what? Like as a video maker, why would you pick this one? Like what could you possibly say about this besides drivel about like getting swords in the UK or whatever?
Sword fighting hobby. But anyway, back to the take. This actually hits upon a point that Dostoevsky makes very briefly in The Idiot, where they're talking about the concept of capital punishment. And Dostoevsky is kind of relaying his own experience of almost being executed by the Tsar, which he was after he was kind of caught up in this conspiratorial circle. It's very interesting. I'll probably make a video on it at some point because I think it really is an event that profoundly affected him. And I'd love to chart this almost execution as it comes up in various different books and short stories. However, one of the things that they discussed.
I think that this is a forced guess, right? Because they could both be here, in which case that would be there. And then it could just be there and there, in which case, yeah. I think this is a forced guess. So I'm just gonna guess here. Okay, cool. So that's 3, so that means these are all safe, and that's just 1. Ah, fuck, we're back in a forced guess. Well, yeah. Yeah, we are. We are. Because there's only 1 here. So I'm just gonna go here. Yeah. That one was lost. Anyway.
In The Idiot is that the thing for Dostoevsky that makes the death penalty so existentially frightening for him, the thing that makes it a horrific fate in his eyes, is that there's the absolute certainty of death. There is no way of getting out of it. The state has you and they can do what they want with you and you are utterly helpless. And interestingly, this is pretty similar, I think.
I can't speak on what Dostoevsky believes.
If I'm remembering correctly, to Camus' argument against capital punishment. And it might be similar to Victor Hugo's. It's weird. A lot of authors touch upon this
Yeah,
point.
that's what it seems like, Canty. Like, it's...
And in some ways, that this commenter puts forward a rather interesting amendment to capital punishment, which would avoid this particular critique, which would be to have it done via duel or have it done via some kind of random or semi-random process whereby the person just has a chance of surviving. I think a kind of orthogonal point to this. I once met someone on.
So, okay, but then it would also mean that whoever that somebody else has the chance of dying, right? Also, like technically, any given execution method also has the chance of failure. I'm sure that there have been failed executions before. Whatever. I don't know.
Train, who proposed to me as a very serious political and moral argument that we should allow people to resolve kind of legal or personal disputes via organized duels or organized boxing matches. And the guy was German, so he was kind of talking a lot about 19th century German dueling history and how he thought that this was a kind of way that they kept a lid on interpersonal violence. And this was clearly something he'd thought about a lot. And he knew an awful lot about the history. I mean, I don't know that much about 19th century German dueling practices. Apparently they kept going
I
until somebody
think
had cuts on
this
their face.
I think this was a joke comment and you're just waxing poetic and saying a bunch of nothing.
When they stopped drawing blood so that people wouldn't kind of completely end their lives. And actually, there was a status thing in World War One, I think, where people would give themselves cuts because it was seen as quite a masculine and also quite a noble thing. It was associated with aristocracy to have been involved in one of these duels, which is, I don't know, just kind of interesting. Fashion truly does change over time. And I don't know, this person's argument was basically that the court system and the civil court system are completely overrun with people having disputes, and at least a fair few of those people would want to resolve it in other ways. So his suggestion was a duel. When we're batting this back and forth, I suggested gambling might be a solution to this. Slightly inspired by a location in the game Fallout New Vegas.
What?
They have a location there where everyone lives in a vault, and because of the way their society is set up, they resolve all disputes via gambling and games of chance. And I just thought that'd be really interesting.
What? They do? I don't remember this vault. I thought I went to all the vaults in New Vegas. I do not remember this one. Uh, I'm actually gonna look that up because like I don't remember that one. I guess I just never went to this one.
Interesting. Like, imagine if you had a civil dispute where both people were sort of not entirely sure that they could win the court case. The court case could go either way, and they'd each have to sink hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars or pounds into legal costs. And one of them just turns to the other and is like, what if we just, I don't know, what if we just play like a game of poker and we see who wins? Well, you know, a game of Uno, I don't care. But like this idea that then you've got that kind of random chance mixed with a bit of skill element, or even just settle it over some dice if you wanted to go truly random chance. I don't know. I think that would be interesting to allow as a legal loophole. I mean, hell,
That sounds horrifying. Why would you? That sounds horrifying, dude. That's oh my god. I don't even know what to say to that one.
maybe it is allowed and nobody goes for it. I'm not a lawyer. But no, I think that that's probably a weirdly defensible version of this idea. Although again, now as
No, that's not weirdly defensible at all. That's like that's so much. That's so bad. Why would you want that? This is not defensible. What are you talking about, man?
nothing to do with the death penalty and also doesn't really involve dueling. But I don't know. This guy's argument has always kind of stuck with me. You know, if two people want to settle a legal dispute or an interpersonal piece of hardship with a boxing match or a kind of low-key, non-lethal duel, I don't know. I don't have a problem with that. There are probably loads of issues with it that I'm just not spotting. But you know, if both parties are signed up to it,
Yeah, you think? Like, are you really like this? Are you really unable to see like of why there would be a difference between or rather why this would be a bad idea? Like you can't even think of one reason why this would be a bad idea off the top of your head.
they both think, oh yeah, the other person doesn't have, you know, a total edge on me, right? Like you wouldn't be able to press gang someone into it because obviously then, I don't know, Mike Tyson would just win all legal disputes.
You could easily press gang somebody into it. That's like one of the you could very easily bully somebody into it. Or if somebody is like not mentally competent, then you might be able to trick them. Or if somebody is just like overzealous, you know? Yeah, he should have just like why did you need to
But this idea that if it's something that both people sign up to, that could be a way of cutting down on court time. I don't know. It's just one of those like madcap ideas that probably and almost certainly wouldn't work. But it's kind of interesting to bring up in conversation. People react to it in different ways, and it's interesting because everyone kind of has an instinctive negative reaction to it. And I'm sure there are so many problems with it, and I'm sure that negative reaction is right. But if you're not informed about the legal process, as I am not, it is really hard to put your finger on exactly what's wrong with it. The dueling death penalty thing, I don't live in a country with the death penalty,
Oh
so
my
I
god.
don't know to what extent that solves the issues that people perceive or don't perceive with the death penalty. I suspect that people would broadly object to the kind of spectacle of gladiatorial combat, but there is an argument that there is some benefit to having public executions if you're going to have them to be properly public, because I think that otherwise there is a tendency that, like a lot of things, it can be lost in kind of euphemisms, right? If public executions and criminal justice
This is just like yapping. Like this doesn't even have anything to do with the question. I'm skipping this. This is just yapping.
okay, our next bit of deliberately bad
Just yammering on and on.
philosophy comes from Fabian Mix 632, and it reads, if too much of a good thing is a bad thing, then at a point, too much of a bad thing should result in a good thing.
Why would you include this?
Obviously, this is poor reasoning. Because, I mean, nothing about it follows, right? Just because too much of a good thing can be a bad thing doesn't mean that too much of a bad thing can be a good thing. You know, if you eat too many sweets, you get sick, even though eating sweets is a pleasurable activity. And if you eat too much of anything, then it makes you sick. It doesn't follow that, I don't know, having bits of you chopped off eventually becomes good. I think part of this is because the intuition behind too much of a good thing can be a bad thing is not really to do with the property of goodness at all.
This is like I don't I have no interest in this. This is not an interesting bad philosophy take. Like there's nothing interesting to say about this. This is just it just doesn't follow.
Okay, our next piece of bad philosophy comes from Gregoire Travail, 1057, and it reads, there is nothing wrong, both morally and ecologically, to want to extend our lives indefinitely. So, I suppose...
Okay. There we go. That's it's like actually something that you can ask, you know? It's not like it's not like I don't want to say interesting. It's not like an original question, I should say. You know, the idea of immortality is not um you know, this has been contemplated for however like this for a very long time. But it's at least like a question. It's at least not like dumb on its face.
ecologically is quite a difficult one to argue there on the basis that obviously if we all lived forever and kept having people, yeah, that would be kind of an ecological disaster. But morally,
Not necessarily. It depends on how we're living forever. Like, to be clear, it's not it's not possible, right? Because like eventually eventually entropy will equalize on average, and there would be no human life. So I, I don't know about that one, but
actually think you have a pretty defensible position there, provided that you get around those particular consequences. The thing I would say, because there's quite a lot of conversation online, even within philosophy circles, that sort of takes it as read that mortality is good and immortality is bad. And this
um
kind of makes sense, right? We are mortal. I think a lot of existential philosophy and crops up a lot in ancient philosophy that people are trying to make sense of their immortality or their own imminent death.
um I mean, I don't believe that. Like, I think pretty straightforwardly that immortality would be good, and that mortality is a bad thing. I feel like the people who believe otherwise are just coping most of the time. And like it makes sense. I'm glad that they have found something that makes it easier for them personally, but I don't believe that it's a considered reasoned opinion. I think it's one that you embrace because you don't have you don't have another option, like very bluntly, you know? There is no other option other than mortality. So, you may as well argue that, it was actually better this way anyway, if that makes you feel better. Well, that's probably going to be a forced guess, but we'll see.
And quite a lot of the time, they hit upon this idea that mortality is in some way actually good and it lends meaning to life. And I think there is something in that. However, I am skeptical of any kind of argument, I suppose, that says something that we currently can't avoid is actually good for us, even if on its face it's something that most people seem to want to avoid. Like,
Hey, slave mortality. True, Shadenkar, exactly. I mean, it is literally slave mortality, right? Like, it's there is literally nothing you can do about it. So it's like, I don't know, like what's the point in saying that like actually it's good, you know? But whatever. Um I credit where it's due. I fully agree with him on this one. Like it doesn't make any sense to me why you would like yeah.
most people don't want to die. Well, they don't want to die at this very moment anyway. They spend a long time trying to keep themselves from dying. People try to keep healthy to live longer and also live more pleasant lives, but live longer.
Fly in my
And if
room.
you told someone that they had a terminal illness, that's a heartbreaking thing to have to tell to someone. And when we receive that news, or when a loved one receives that news, we accept that something bad has happened, which doesn't jive overly well with the idea that, dying actually doesn't matter or is secretly good for us. If somebody at the age of 60, say, discovers that they're going to die within the next 5 years, then I don't know, that sounds like it's a bad thing for them, right? That sounds like it is a harm that they're undergoing. And you can make the argument that, okay, Epicurus
I mean, sure, it could be, well, okay, just to defend the argument a little bit. Like it could be that it's a harm, but that in the long run, like it's somehow good. I don't know. I'm not really gonna try to defend it super hard because again, I don't agree with people who instinctively say that mortality is like good for us. Because I just don't have that intuition at all. I have the exact opposite intuition. I feel like mortality is, maybe is like terrible, but yeah.
style, once they die, they will no longer exist. And so there really is no one for the harm to happen to. And I think that's fine. But I'm just skeptical because a lot of it kind of smacks of motivated reasoning. And I don't think the reasoning is necessarily bad. But I think that we might not be able to quite tell who's won this argument until we have the choice of immortality and we see what immortal beings actually live like. It could be that if somebody is immortal, they live for about 300 years and then they do become just completely sick of life. All of their loved ones are dead, all of their friends are dead. They can't keep coming up with new reasons to live. They just want to shuffle off the mortal coil now.
I mean, wouldn't you just forget at some point? Like we don't have infinite capacity for memory. You would just forget and find new loved ones. Sounds easy enough to me. I don't know.
If that's true, then the mortality argument would have been vindicated. It turns out, yes, mortality does add meaning to life, and then if you live too long, you will eventually become sick of it. On the other hand, it could be that people are quite happy to live for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and that we actually never seem to find the point where, barring some kind of exceptionally awful circumstance that someone just can't get out of, say they have a horrible medical condition or they're
All
being
right, this
constantly
is a
tortured or something
forced
like that,
guess, and I don't
people actually
I don't feel like calculating at all. So I'm just gonna say it's here. Bam. Oh well.
do decide to live forever and don't face some kind of horrific consequence from it. And if that's the case, then it kind of seems like the existential argument for the value of mortality has been falsified. I suspect that I won't be around.
Well, okay, no, that's not necessarily true because immortality means forever, right? Like you haven't shown via any finite length of time that immortality is better. Like it could be the next thousand, like after 1,000 years. Like it could always, in principle, be that the next uh that the next 1,000 years after however long you've lived will be in such horrible pain that uh that it averages out to being bad for you. I'm not saying that's likely, but it's possible in principle. So the argument has technically not been refuted.
Around to see where this debate goes. If there were to be immortality creating technology released within my lifetime, I would probably go for it on the basis that, it wouldn't make you completely immortal. Presumably, it would make you ageless. And as a result, you would always have the option of ducking out wherever to get completely and utterly miserable. But it would.
Yeah. I mean, again though, it's like eventually the heat death comes for us all. So, the sun will explode eventually. So,
Just be a fun empirical philosophical experiment to run. This kind of point about immortality being very bad for humans and that actually mortality is what lends our lives meaning, I would personally withhold judgment on that until it has been tested. Until then, it just smacks.
it can't be tested, man. It literally cannot be tested, like even in principle. Because there is no it is an infinite, it requires an infinite length of time. And so unless you could make people like perceive it progressively faster and faster such that it like converges to a finite length, like there will never be a point at which the task has completed and you can evaluate it.
Of being just a little bit too convenient. Like, isn't it so brilliant that we just so happened to be able to transmute this on the face of it quite awful thing into something that is actually desirable? A thought experiment to illustrate this might be something like this. If the human
I basically agree, so I'm not gonna belabor that one. All right, that video was weird. That was a really weird video. uh, I don't I, like most of them were not interesting philosophical takes at all, and it just ended with him like yapping about like shit that wasn't relevant. Hi, Jolie Mammoth. I think it's Jolie Mammoth. But yeah, this is just like a really, really strange and just not at all interesting video. Like it wasn't even really that interesting to comment on. So I don't know. I've been going for an hour and a half. Should I do anything else? Should I read something? Do I want to keep talking? What have I got open in Zotero that I might read? I'm not gonna read Latour tonight. Um, Never heard of 17776. Um, all right, I have some marks open in in Zotero because I'm researching a video about materialism because most people's popular understanding of it is wrong, at least as it pertains to Marx. Um, Yeah. I don't know. I'm just gonna end here because I don't have anything else in the tank. So, take care, y'all. Thanks for coming. It was a short stream, but next time I stream, I will probably be reading Latour again. I'm gonna see if Envy will come back on. Um, I don't know. I guess in case, like, is anything you guys request that I react to? Anything really bad out there? I can't think of anything, so